Okay. So this teach-in is going to be on the Clean Energy Jobs Act, or CEJA. We're going to start by going through the pillars of CEJA, which will be led by our speakers, Elaine Nekritz, Pastor Booker Vance, Andrew Rehn, and Matt Steffen, who are all part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, which is the coalition working to get CEJA passed this spring. Afterwards, we'll open for a Q&A. So while we're going, please put any questions you might have into the chat, and I'll keep tabs on those. As well, once our presenters finish, if you would prefer to ask your question yourself, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll unmute you. If you're calling in and you'd like to raise your hand, you can do so by pressing *9. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elaine Nekritz, who's going to go ahead and get us started.
Thanks, Paloma, and thanks all of you for tuning in to learn a little bit more about the Clean Energy Jobs Act. I can imagine it's pretty overwhelming because I still feel overwhelmed by the provisions of CEJA, having worked on it for 3 years. So cut yourself some slack and take in what you can. But we'll have a lot of good information for you today. I think one of the important things to know about the Clean Energy Jobs Act and CEJA is that it was developed through a whole bunch of community listening sessions that we held all over the state, including at least one of these community listening sessions in every state Senate district. That was over 100 community events that we call Listen, Lead, Share, and got a lot of really important feedback during those listening sessions. So CEJA was not written by or for the benefit of any particular company, any individual utility company, or any industry. It was really written to benefit all Illinoisans. And I know you hear it in a lot of places, but CEJA truly is about putting people over profit. And this contrasts CEJA with really all the other energy bills that have been proposed. So as I said, the bill is over 900 pages long, includes a lot of very technical stuff, but at its core, we're really seeking to do 4 things. One is to eliminate carbon emissions, and we do that through closing coal plants and dramatically reducing carbon emissions elsewhere, especially in the transportation sector. Second is to ensure investments in the clean energy economy go to every community, and that Black and brown people especially are able to build wealth from those investments. We seek to keep energy costs affordable, and lastly, to hold utility companies accountable. So some of the other speakers will address some of those. I'm going to focus primarily on some of the energy provisions. So for a lot of us, when we think about eliminating or reducing carbon emissions, we think about wind, solar, electric vehicles, and those kinds of things. But the cheapest and most effective way to reduce carbon emissions is to never use the energy in the first place, whether that's either electric energy or natural gas. Which is why I think one of CEJA's best kept secrets is the significant investments in energy efficiency, both, again, electric and natural gas. But what does that even mean, energy efficiency? So it's pretty standard stuff. It means more efficient water heaters, furnaces, stoves, dishwashers. It means windows and doors that keep cold air out in the winter and hot air out in the summer. It means new insulation in the attic and other places in our homes. Unless you think that these individual actions in our own homes aren't as significant as what some big polluting company and corporation might do, I want to disabuse you of that notion right now. Because the biggest spikes in energy use are in the morning when we all get up, turn on the lights, start the coffee maker, use hot water, and run the electric toothbrush. And the second big spike in energy use in the day is in the early evening when we come home from work, cook dinner, do the dishes, wash clothes, whatever. So the energy generation from whatever source, be it natural gas, a coal plant that produces electricity, nuclear plants, wind and solar, the whole system is designed to meet that peak demand and during the day. And that peak demand is what we create in our homes. So if each of us takes action to be more efficient and use less power, that means we don't need to generate as much electricity, especially from those dirty coal-fired power plants. So the energy provisions in CEJA are projected to save $700 million a year. I want to repeat that, $700 million a year for consumers just from reducing our use of natural gas and electricity. So The final point I will make on energy efficiency is it is where the jobs are in the clean energy economy. Before the pandemic, there were over 90,000 people employed in energy efficiency work in Illinois. That far exceeds the number of people hired at coal-fired power plants and nuclear plants combined. And that represents also 15,000 small businesses in Illinois that are engaged in energy efficiency work. And Pastor Vance may talk a little bit more about that, because that's probably for small business people, that's the most accessible type of work in the clean energy economy. So in addition to energy efficiency, CEJA does a couple of other things. It puts Illinois on a path to achieve a goal of 100% renewable energy by 2050. And we do that by ramping up the investment and the installation of both wind and solar energy, and by requiring all of the coal-fired power plants in Illinois to shut down by 2030. And I would just add that shutting down coal-fired power plants by the year 2030 will really put Illinois at the forefront nationally of addressing climate change. And that's not an impossible goal. The economics of coal plants themselves right now don't work, and it's much more expensive, especially as the price of wind and solar comes down. So those coal plants are closing regardless of what we do, but we want to make sure that it happens in an orderly fashion, and that it does so in a way that protects the public health as best we can. 40% of people who live near a coal plant are people of color, 38% are low income. So we want to make sure that the coal plants in those that are near those communities or in those communities close first, and that's what CEJA does. So we also did an analysis of the investment from the private sector that could come to Illinois as a result of our commitment to 100% renewable energy by 2050. And that analysis indicates that there would be $30 billion of investment coming to Illinois from the build out of renewable energy. So that would be a huge boon to us, and would bring a lot of needed jobs. So I would say we have about 50 days. I haven't counted exactly May 31st, but it's about 50 days to pass clean energy legislation in this spring session of the Illinois legislature. And unintended, your energy is needed to get this across the finish line. So I appreciate that you're getting involved, stepping up and advocating with not only legislators, but also encouraging others to become involved in this. That is this important work of saving the planet, saving our communities, and saving our future. So with that, I will turn it over to my good friend, Pastor Booker Vance, who has been involved in this work longer than I have, and has really been a leader and a stalwart in making sure that the clean energy economy comes to Illinois, but that it comes out to us in an equitable way. So Pastor Vance, take it away.
Amen. Thank you, Elaine. Elaine is just a blessing, and she's working with us really hard and been a good leader for us, and I'm thankful for her support. I have the great hair to prove it. We've been involved in this thing since CEJA, before the clean energy process began, and we're excited about passing CEJA, but now we're trying to pass CEJA, and that's been, so we learned some things from CEJA. We've improved some things in relationship to what we're doing in CEJA, and we're also expanding our vision to look at clean energy and beyond, and CEJA and beyond. I'm one of the things I know on the phone is most of you, as I can already see in the chat, well versed on a lot of the dynamics around CEJA, so I know I'm talking really to the choir, but the goal that we do in Lobby Day is how do we motivate the choir? How do we motivate you to be able to engage some of our legislators who are getting it from all sides? And it's important for you to educate yourself on what else is going on in the clean energy space so that you can be clear about the important points and the salient points of this legislation, and how the things that we're emphasizing and important aspects of CEJA are important for our legislators to know. And so I want to talk a little bit about about equity workforce development. One of the things that was very critical in the first part of the CEJA legislation was this issue of workforce and training and also jobs. And as Sister Elaine talked about this discussion about we had solar jobs, we also had energy efficiency jobs. And those of us who were in the conversation early on, and she laid out some of the data, was the energy efficiency jobs were the ones that were really going to be more sustainable. And the workforce with the solar jobs are going to be a little more challenging. And that proved to be true, and it continues to be true. But we, again, are facing these challenges, trying to help some of our companies in particular become more open to equity, more open to diversity, more open to making sure that we are impacting our communities by hiring folk on different levels. The groups that we particularly involved in this first discussion was returning citizens, which were folk who had been incarcerated or in the system and were coming out, and we wanted to make sure that they had an opportunity to have jobs and to be able to be trained and to do that. We also had what we call foster care alumni, and that was another group of individuals that we made sure that we focused on. We also continue to do women and workforce training for women, and also, again, as you know, people of color, and that runs the whole gamut of trying to make sure, as we talked about, building wealth in our communities and doing training. But the goal is not necessarily, I realized after we got involved, that solar was a great industry and continues to be a great industry, but the real challenge is diversifying it and helping companies to learn how to be more inclusive and engaging. And so we still continue to work on that in that particular endeavor. But the energy efficiency industry is one that seems to be better equipped to deal with some of the challenges that we have in relationship to diversifying. And then we can develop people with not only certifications, but also be able to apply and to begin this dynamic. The other part with equity and the workforce development was the new proposal that's coming up in CEJA, which is one it's not really controversial. It's probably one of the most practical aspects of this, but it is one of the more challenging because we have different people who are stakeholders who are trying to get engaged, and they kind of come at this thing from a different perspective. So let me talk a little bit about workforce hubs. When I first came in this industry, reality when we did CEJA was it was very Chicago centric. And as you know, most things are in this state, for whatever reason, continue to be Chicago centric. And it's not because of the reality of this bill is designed for all of Illinois, but the challenge is that because most things have run through Chicago and not necessarily through Springfield, that we have continued kind of challenges. And so in the bill, we really push to have what we call workforce hubs, which is 16 hubs throughout the state, and the desire to do training, and also not only with training, but out of the training to have projects in those same areas, solar projects and others, so that folk who came out of the training would be able to go into projects. One of the reasons that the capacity for most workers is that the more projects they get under their belt, the more marketable they are in the workforce field. And so one of the things in this legislation has been to spread the training out throughout the state so everyone has access, and then to have the training and the certifications move into jobs, which will be done by projects. And so the goal is we continue to push companies to be doing their work and then to hire folk around the state. And that's the kind of the vision behind the equity workforce plan with the hubs in this particular the particular CEJA bill that we're working on. And so that continues to be with it, but solar and energy efficiency are what we're kind of pushing. And so I guess the part that I want to close with, or at least one of the discussions about equity, is a new concept. It's not a new idea, it's just a new concept. And we've seen equity kind of played out in a bunch of different areas. We believe CEJA has one of the best kind of layouts because we have a equity formula for companies to be able to show that they are committed to hiring equity, to diversifying their workforce and to do that. And that there's a whole equity provision and there's a formula to prove that you're in that right direction. But there are also other bills that we've seen in recent years that have helped us begin to talk about tightening up this equity discussion. In the Black Caucus, in the pillars that they just recently put forth, there's a real strong equity provision that we want to make sure we align with, because we don't want to have A and B not understanding that we can support each other in the goals of equity. And then the cannabis bill, which is a bad word for some folk, but the cannabis bill that existed also had a strong equity provision in it. And we want to learn from those. And right now we're having conversations with the Clean Jobs, that's not the Clean Jobs, what is it? The unions, particularly in their effort to, and we've got them talking equity. So that's a wonderful effort that we've been trying to work on. And so those are the things that if we can make sure we align these conversations, because you know what happens, this is an African saying, when two elephants fight, the only thing that gets messed up is the ground. And what we want to make sure as we come to the conclusion of passing CEJA, as we talked about in 50 days, we want to make sure when all the wrangling goes on that we have equitable jobs, we have workforce development throughout the state, and then we also have companies that are hiring folk so that people can build wealth and take care of their families and their neighborhoods and community. And so I'm just real thankful for this time, the opportunity. That's a brief kind of overview, but we want you to be excited so that when you can do the research, that there's a link that you'll be given to look at some of the fact sheets and so forth. But when you get ready for Lobby Day on the 24th, that are right, 26th, 26th. When we get to Lobby Day, that you're motivated and excited and you're ready to engage in the conversation. I was on a lobby call in DC and with the national legislators, and this whole virtual thing is a good opportunity for us to do the work that we're doing, but we just have to take advantage of it. So you get your little team together and everybody has their little part of the speech, and you tag team on a legislator and you get it done, and that's the part. So that's why this conversation is really important, so that we can begin to help you be prepared to be engaged in this whole issue of CEJA and particularly with equity workforce. And so thank you for your time. I don't hope I missed anything, but we'll have questions and so forth later. And I think it's Matt. Yeah, who's next? Matt is next. So Matt Steffens, my friend, my favorite lobbyist from Springfield and engagement, and just is a blessing. So continue. Please welcome Matt at this particular time.
Thanks, Pastor Vance. Paloma, I can see your screen. Can you hear me okay? Maybe nod. All right, cool. So the section that I'm covering today is the transportation electrification pillar of CEJA. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just have a few slides, and they don't go into great detail, but I think it's helpful for keeping kind of the different sections straight. So I think I'm sharing my screen. Paloma, I can still see your screen. If you can get a thumbs up, maybe. All right, great. Great. So thanks for joining today, everyone. It's, this is, I think this will be my 8th environmental lobby day. So it's always incredible to see how many people get involved and are willing to participate in the day. And this year we have a bunch of exciting bills we're working on, with CEJA kind of being the flagship bill once again. So one of the main pillars of CEJA is transportation. This is new for us as far as energy bills go. The last bill that we worked on, which Pastor Vance mentioned, was the Future Energy Jobs Act. That didn't contain a transportation provision. So it's exciting that this is kind of a new, this is an extremely important sector if we're going to reach our climate goals. Especially given that the transportation sector is now the leading source of carbon pollution in Illinois as well as the United States, and it's responsible for roughly 1/3 of all carbon emissions. That being the case, CEJA sets forth a goal to remove the equivalent of 1 million gasoline and diesel powered vehicles from our roads, and it does so in a few ways, but the kind of main strategies here are to expand access to transit, promote walking, biking, and mobility, and then accelerate electric vehicle adoption, both at the kind of consumer vehicle level as well as the fleet level, both for private and public fleets. if managed correctly, you know, electric vehicle adoption offers a ton of benefits to Illinois, including the emission reductions, which, you know, I should mention it's not only carbon emission reductions. We're also reducing localized pollution like carbon monoxide, ground level ozone, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and these are the pollutants that very directly affect our health every day, especially communities that, you know, low-income communities, communities of color who often find themselves along transportation corridors, and that leads to higher exposure to these pollutants and worse health outcomes. So that's a huge benefit of electrifying transportation and increasing use of these other modes. I'll also mention that lower fuel and maintenance costs of EVs combined with cost benefits to the electric grid make EVs a really attractive investment that could save Illinois residents billions of dollars in several different ways. And I'll just quickly add to that. EVs build on the work that we're doing on the clean energy side, right? So the cleaner our grid is, the cleaner our electric vehicles are, because they're pulling their fuel off of our grid. So these policies work hand in hand in a very direct way, not to mention all of the other grid benefits that electrification can provide. So we'll dig into that maybe a little bit, but that's just my first slide. So I should probably go ahead and move on now, huh? So each of these slides here is just going to break down kind of the different sections within the transportation electrification portion of CEJA. So kind of the first major program within that is what we refer to as the Electric Vehicle Access for All program. So as you can see here, this program includes a few different provisions. The most notable ones, I would say, are providing short-term access to rentable EVs through an EV car sharing program. It would also create a carbon-free last mile initiative to provide clean transportation that extends traditional public transit's reach. So this is an important one. So, you know, for those of us who regularly use transit, it's often the case where the mode of transit that you want to use is a bit too far to walk to or to easily get to. This would create a program to close that what's called last mile between you and the transit that you want to use to take your full trip. So this program is pretty wide open and really encourages innovation in this space to get people from where they are to transit option easily, quickly, efficiently, safely. So that's kind of the idea behind this program. And then of course, the final piece here, which I think a lot of people will be interested in, is CEJA creates a low-income EV rebate. So the very top line note here about that rebate is it is an income qualified program that provides up to $4,000 for an EV at or below a new EV at or below $45,000, or a $4,000 rebate for a used electric vehicle at or below $35,000. So there's a bit more detail to that, but that's kind of the high level. The next section I'll jump to is the EV mass market in utility territories. So that's not a super sexy name, but the short version of what this is doing is that this portion of CEJA would provide an EV charger rebate for customers who participate in programs that benefit the grid. So if you buy an EV, install a charger in your home, and agree to participate in your utilities demand rate program, you will get a rebate incentive for your charger. So that's basically telling the grid that you agree to charge your electric vehicle at times when there is low electricity demand. And that way you're helping the utility kind of balance out their energy, you're using energy at a time when others are not using it, which helps benefit the grid, helps balance loads. It would help build new EV charging stations in dense or low-income areas. This is extremely important. We know that EV proliferation is very much dependent on the availability of charging. So by making charging more available, you make it easier for more people to get an EV, and that's how you grow the EV fleet. And finally, this would build quick charging stations in rural areas and along highways. So this would reduce, something, kind of a phrase that a lot of people hear when they're working in EVs is range anxiety. So people who aren't going to get an EV because they're worried that their battery is going to run out of juice for that 1 or 2 trips a year they use that might take them a few hundred miles. These types of quick chargers along highways help alleviate that worry, because if someone wants to take a longer trip, they know that they'll be charging there along the way. The electric vehicle charging readiness provision. So I won't go through this in great detail, but the short version is CEJA requires that, it expands access to charging for those living in multi-unit dwellings or those relying on non-residential charging. So that can mean a few different things. But this provision would also make sure that any new build or renovations where there's electric work being done, it would require that those, when doing those renovations, whoever's doing that needs to provide at least the ability to install EV charging. So the idea here is it is much, much less expensive to put in that infrastructure to allow for EV charging while you're doing that type of work than going back and ripping up walls and doing all those things later when EV charging is needed. So it's meant to kind of build in some efficiencies when that kind of work is being done. You can install this charging. It's not expensive to do if you're already doing that kind of work, and it just kind of builds in some efficiencies there. And then the last, I think 2 slides here. So medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification, this is super important. We treat this a little bit differently than the light duty side because these are usually fleet vehicles. And this provision would fund transit vehicles and infrastructure so that we can electrify our public fleets with kind of a special emphasis on school buses. Actually, the school buses provide not only are they carrying children who are at about tailpipe height in many cases, but they're very predictable in their routes, and so they're often we know with great detail when those buses are parked in their lots and when they're on the road, and you can think of them as giant batteries in a way. So they provide huge storage benefits because we kind of know where they'll be predictably, and they're large vehicles with a lot of storage capacity. And of course, these efforts is also focus on low income and environmental justice communities, as well as reducing grid costs. There's a lot of cost savings opportunity here. And then I'll put a link in the chat where you can read a lot more about this provision. Basically, the state of Illinois received a lot of money from when VW was caught cheating on their emissions. So right now, the state has about $89 million left in that VW settlement environmental mitigation fund left. And we still have about $70 million from the last capital budget that we can use towards electrification infrastructure. CEJA would just require that these funds are combined and there's a plan put together to spend them all together. So there's a lot of efficiencies to be had there if all of this money is used together instead of it kind of being used in an uncoordinated way. I'll put that in the chat shortly. And then the last slide here is kind of the $1 million question or millions of dollars question. How is it paid for? And it's major utilities. So ComEd and Ameren largely will directly fund the medium and heavy duty vehicle programs up to $35.5 million per year, the EV structure, and then on the EV infrastructure side, up to $24.85 million a year within their service territories, respectively. And then utilities will reimburse the state for the EV Access for All program. So I will stop sharing my screen now and put the link to the VW story. It just came out last week. It's we think it's a good editorial from the Sun-Times. So check that out if you want to learn more about that. And with that, I think I'm passing it to Andrew Rehn from the Prairie Rivers Network.
All right. Can you hear me all right? Cool. Well, I'm also going to share my screen, so give me a second. Okay, does that look right? Cool, great. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about just transition and decarbonization in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Normally not super nervous for presentations like this, but my dad is watching. So hi, Dad. Here we go. So first thing I want to talk about is just sort of the general trajectory of coal generation. We know that coal is going away. Economically, it doesn't make as much sense as it did before, and we've been seeing coal closures across the state. Vistra announced a closure, well, they announced an advanced closure yesterday, but 4 power plants closed in the last year or so, and another 5 are up in the next 5 years, I think, maybe 6. So we know that coal is kind of going away in Illinois. At the same time, other companies have not announced closures. We don't know what the fate of those plants are going to be. So coal is on a declining trajectory, but it's not clear when and how that's going to happen. So this gets us to decarbonization. And this means getting all fossil fuels out of the electric sector. And we feel that an equitable decarbonization is the way to go, and that is what we have in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. What we mean by an equitable decarbonization is that it is decarbonization that focuses the most progress first in areas where pollution is causing the worst impact. So high density population areas would be the first power plants that close in CEJA's decarbonization. We'd move the electric sector to 100% carbon free by 2030. This would be statewide no carbon electric sector. We do this through a equitable stakeholder process. So we recognize that it's important that all voices be considered. This is a regulatory process. The Illinois EPA would be the agency that's administering the decarbonization through declining pollution caps. So each power plant would have a cap, and those caps would start declining based on sort of a predetermined plan. And these plans and processes would be developed through public hearings, rulemaking, stakeholder process, engaging communities, people affected by pollution, people who work at the power plants, everybody would be involved in the conversation, so that we did this process right in a way that is fully equitable. So that's sort of the decarbonization side of things. And again, it's happening through a regulatory process. We also think that an important part of decarbonization is just transition. And this means a lot of things to a lot of people. The way we use just transition is to essentially say that we're going to support the communities that had these fossil fuel plants as they move away from those, as they move away from fossil fuels to clean energy or to other economies that might make sense for those communities. So we want this to be sort of driven and include participation from the communities themselves, because they know they're members of their own community and they know what they want to have happen there. So so we have broken out inside CEJA. There's sort of 3 major components of this just transition, 3 pieces of the program, and those are the workers, the communities, and the local economy. And we have different policies that will benefit each of those groups. So for workers, there's two major things. The first thing we do for workers is put some requirements on the employers, things like advanced notice of closure, so that the workers know when the power plant is going to close, so they can start making a plan to move on to whatever is next for them. Providing employment information so that the workers know from their employer what other employment information might be available. We're requiring 1 year of health insurance protection at power plants that are closing and causing workers to lose their jobs, and retirement account protection. We are also proposing employee benefits, and these would be coming from a state administered program, and I'll get into funding later. But these include career planning assistance from staff that are there to help plan help people to think through what they want to do next. Scholarships to things like public universities, community colleges, trade schools, The intent here is to have it be pretty open towards programs that people want to pursue. That's going to give them an education that will allow them to find new career paths. And we're also building out the equitable workforce hubs, and that would be another pathway for folks to go to find what's next. I do want to say that we don't prescribe clean energy jobs for all of these folks. We recognize that that's not necessarily what makes sense for somebody leaving a fossil fuel power plant. That's not necessarily their career set. But we do want to open up opportunities so that folks have a chance to find what works for them, whether it's more continuing to work in industry or going into business or whatever pathway they want to take. We think that we should be empowering them to do that. And I do want to address, I saw a question in the chat about, these are high paying jobs. And that is one of the tricky things about what's happening here, is that there are a lot of high paying jobs. One thing to keep in mind is that Illinois has no programs to support these workers as is. Power plant communities, there's nothing right now that's going to support them. And these power plants will all eventually close. So yes, we are looking at doing a transition that will force closure sooner at many of these plants, but at the same time, that's going to happen anyways. And we think it's important to have a program in place to support them. If we don't have this, there would just be nothing. And when they lost their jobs eventually, they would have nothing else. That's why we think the workforce support is so important. For communities, we would designate power plant communities as clean energy empowerment zones. What this means is that the area around the power plant and areas that are maybe a lot of workers from that power plant are designated as empowerment zones. For empowerment zones, they can apply for property tax replacement. Talking to mayors and other community leaders, this is a big factor of what is a concern when a power plant is closed is, well, they made up a huge percentage of our property tax. So how are we going to keep on running our schools? How are we going to keep on running our other civil services? Property tax replacement gives those communities a chance to transition to a new normal, whether that means attracting new businesses and having that revenue be replaced, or it means figuring out what a smaller version of what they have is. Whatever that is, giving them a window of 5 years to get there will ease the cost to these communities and help them find that new path forward. We're also looking at sort of pretty broad engagement in community energy and climate planning. So these are, there's clean energy empowerment zone task forces in each community, and those are making sure that this whole process has that public input and that public discussion happening, so folks are able to have some amount of self-determination as they navigate through the transition. And then supporting local economies. This happens in two ways. One is through tax credits. If you're going to employ a displaced energy worker, that displaced energy worker's salary can be taken 20% in the first year, then 15, and then 10 can be taken as a tax credit. So we're getting these workers employed by incentivizing businesses to hire them. We're also proposing tax credits for developing renewable energy projects in clean energy empowerment zones, a way to attract all these clean energy projects that we're going to be building out, attract them to locations where these large fossil fuel power plants have been closed, and hopefully be able to use them to replace some of this tax-based loss. So how's this managed? The Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity is the agency in the government that will be managing the clean energy empowerment zones and the other parts of this program, including sort of the staff support. How is it paid for? The CEJA creates the Energy Community Reinvestment Fund, and this is a fund that would collect money from polluters. So when we talk to all those community groups across the state in the Listen, Lead, Share events, we heard from them that polluters should be paying. They've caused a lot of local harm, the harm that communities have felt from the pollution of power plants in their communities, and we heard loud and clear that this should be coming from them. So we would propose to implement a pollutant fee on fossil fuel power plants. If you're burning, if you're making carbon, if you're burning fuel, there's a pollutant fee associated with that, and also a coal severance fee on coal mining. And I should say, now that I mentioned the coal severance fee, almost all the programs that we're specifying here would also apply to coal mining communities. So recognizing that there is a transition in coal mining communities that needs to happen as well, but we want to support those where there's sudden mine closures. We want to support those communities and workers. So these programs go to fossil fuel power plants and coal mines. So the pollution fee is determined by essentially the need of these programs, and it's spread out among the polluters based on how much pollution they're creating. So while they're still operating, we're going to be levying a fee in order to sort of fund the transition programs, and we have a cap on that fee of 1 cent per kilowatt hour. The coal severance fee is a 6% fee on the sale price of every ton of coal that's mined. Coal severance fees are a really common mechanism in large mining states across the country. We haven't had one in Illinois forever, and this is a very common way that communities will sort of make money on the coal mining happening in their community. So what does the budget for this program look like? So it's sized up at $230 million, and we're looking at that funding a huge array of programs. And one thing I want to flag here is that our equitable workforce programs, things that Pastor Vance spoke about earlier, are funded by the same pool of money. But the money here, up to $100 million, can go to property tax offsets. We don't expect it necessarily to be that high. That is a number that's designed to encourage some flexibility. If there is a single year that there's a lot of closures, we want to have more money available for those years, expecting it to be lesser in other years. $22 million in tax credit replacement. That's for the hiring credits and the incentives for businesses development. $14 million for the displaced worker career services. That includes the training, the tuition. $2 million for economic development funding. This is the staff that would be required to support these clean energy empowerment zones, and then $30 million for low-income bill offsets. And this is sort of an additional way to support low-income consumers and make sure that they're not suffering unduly or unable to pay. This sort of like a LIHEAP program. And that's it. Yeah, so this is so the clean energy, the workforce programs are also funded by that money. I sort of said that already, but that's what the slide says. And so that's it. So that's sort of a broad overview of what we're doing to both decarbonize and support fossil fuel communities in that transition. So with that, I'll hand it back to Paloma. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And now we'll open it up for some Q&A. I'm going to start with the questions that I've gotten in the chat, and we'll get through as many of those as we can in the time remaining. So the first one I have is from Jacqueline Casaza, who sent it to me directly. She asks, does closing coal plants by 2030 mean completely closing and retiring them, or just getting a commitment from operators to close, i.e. might actually close later, like 2035 or 2040?
The coal severance fee, or sorry, our decarbonization is regulatory enforced. So there are declining caps on the amount of pollution that can come out of power plants, and those caps decline to 0. This isn't just carbon, this is all pollutants that come out of power plants. And many things like coal sequestration or carbon sequestration that you see people implement, even if they had that doesn't prevent the other pollutants. So the answer is yes, we would enforce through regulation by 2030 that they all close.
Thank you. And our next question, I think, would be good for Elaine. Utilities try to limit consumers. Oh, sorry, this is from Alan Lindrup. Utilities try to limit consumers who produce solar energy using net metering. Does CEJA address net metering?
Yes. And we do know that's a problem. You know, that I'm not the expert on this, so there may be still some issues in the municipal and co-op areas. And Andrew, I don't know if you can speak more directly to that, but yeah, we do have requirements that would prevent the utilities from discriminating against people who want to put solar rooftop on.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak to net metering and uni co-ops. Sorry.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
All right. Then our next question comes from Renee Hoff, who asks, Elaine mentioned that CEJA should save around $7 million a year in energy costs. Can you give some examples of where the savings will be experienced?
Sure. So that's the kind of thing I think that I was speaking to in my opening remarks, that, you know, energy efficiency is not like high profile and big and sexy. It is the small things that we all do every day to to buy a more energy efficiency heater, to go to a tankless water heater if you can, to make sure that we're not losing gas through just leakage on the lines as they come to the house, and that we're putting in energy efficient windows and doors so that the heater doesn't have to work overtime to make sure that the homes are heated. And so it is really those kinds of very basic sort of things that we do in our homes. And then the same thing would be true for commercial and industrial facilities as well. It's a larger scale, but it's very similar kinds of activities.
Awesome, thanks. Our next question comes from Barbara Scott, who asks how affordability and effectiveness of CEJA will be impacted if the Biden's infrastructure bill would pass.
All right.
Sorry, could you repeat that one, Paloma?
Yes. How will affordability and effectiveness of CEJA be impacted if the Biden infrastructure bill were to pass?
Elaine, I think you were going to hop in. I could add something on transportation afterwards.
Why don't you start?
Sure. So I would just say that from what we've seen of the infrastructure package, there's not a huge amount of detail, but the White House has released kind of in broad strokes what they're looking to fund at least and how much. I think it would complement CEJA very well. So we've heard from the White House that they plan to build 500,000 EV charging stations, add 40 to 50 million EVs to the road in the US by 2030, that they would dedicate 85 billion for transit electrification. And I think that 85 might include some shipping and freight electrification as well. And then the big number is 174 billion for electric vehicles. So that's going to include point of sale rebates, tax incentives for consumers. I think they put a provision on that, tying it to American-made vehicles, but in reading their language, I wasn't totally sure if it only would include that. It looks to replace 50,000 diesel transit vehicles with electric vehicles, electrify at least 20% of our school bus fleet, and electrify the full federal fleet, including the U.S. Postal Service. So, these are all things that are kind of like federal versions of what CEJA is trying to do. So at the state level in Illinois, we're also going to include our rebates on electric vehicles to low-income buyers. So I think these things would all stack and just continue to make electrification and EVs more and more attractive. So I guess the big answer would be, I think it complements what CEJA is trying to do very well, or maybe CEJA complements it given the sizes. But I think, yeah, those are the highlights for me.
I'm not the policy expert in the Clean Jobs Coalition, and there's probably people on this call who know more about the proposed federal bill than I do. But I would just say generally that the regulation of electricity generation and distribution is a primarily state function. So I would just echo what Matt said, that I think these stack and are complementary, but both are necessary.
Thanks, guys. Our next question is going to be another one for Matt. Daniel Craybill asks, what work is being done on infrastructure development for recharging electric vehicles? Of course, seeing more gas stations all over, but not so many charging stations. Also going to note that Christina Murphy did put a link to plugshare.com into the chat, and as well noted that feds, IDOT, and local governments are working on a network currently. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, there are some good tools to find existing charging stations in your area. PlugShare is one of them. There are a few others. So making use of those tools. I will say, I see what you mean with on the gas station point. There's one of those on every corner. I will note that the EV charging can be a little bit more downstated than that. So you'll find them in front of your, like one, a couple stations in front of a Walgreens or at a bank, or they're not going to be these kind of huge complexes with a convenience store attached, but they'll be a little bit more discreet. That's one thing to note. But we definitely building more EV stations and building them in low-income areas with multifamily dwellings is a big deal. I think figuring out ways to get them in right of ways on streets so that folks can charge where they live, like very important. And then the other one is at workplaces. So I think you'll more and more see those things built out. I got another question. I think it was from Matthew Beach about kind of the business model about how to build out charging. I mean, I think CEJA has a mix. So there's both like the goals of here's how much charging we want and the areas in which we need to have it, and setting up incentives and rebates to get that done. And then there's public charging that'll be owned and operated by a municipality or maybe a utility that is following a different model. That's kind of getting charging where it might not be a business is saying that's not going to fit our model, but we know we need charging there because we need it to kind of link together our full network. So there's kind of like there's two versions of charging that CEJA contemplates.
Can I jump in here, Paloma, just for a second? Because I think this is an important point that hasn't been highlighted so far, I think, in the questions as much, is that what we tried to do in CEJA was to make sure that the benefits of the clean energy economy reach every community and every individual that wants it. And so what CEJA does, I think, is focus less on the places where, like there's going to be a charging station in front of every Whole Foods. There's going to be a charging station at Walgreens. But is there going to be a charging station in low-income communities and communities that have traditionally not received the kind of investment? And that's where CEJA focuses its effort.
Thanks for that. Kind of going along that same vein, question from Bill Reedy. Does CEJA have a provision for utility companies to battery store power in remote areas for EV charging?
No. So not specifically charging EVs with battery storage, at least not that I know of. I think CEJA contemplates we want to get chargers that can pull from the grid, hopefully a very, very clean grid, and put that directly to an EV. I don't know I think it's broad enough though to where if someone had a model to where that's something that they would want to do, they'd want to build storage, have storage, and then charge an EV off storage. CEJA certainly wouldn't prevent that. And they could probably still benefit from some of the rebates and incentives within CEJA, but it does not explicitly create that model, no.
Thanks. Next EV question comes from Cynthia Canner. And that one is the village of Algonquin just started charging for electricity in their charging stations. What in general is a fair cost per kilowatt hour?
Yeah, I saw that question, Cynthia. It's beyond me though, so I gotta check. I can figure out how to find that out. But as far as I understand, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. I'll look into it and get back to you.
Awesome. Okay. The next one comes from Renee Hoff, who asks, "How will the bill impact traditional car mechanic businesses and jobs?" Whole bunch for you today, yeah. Matt.
I either did a terrible job of presenting and it left a ton of questions. I think it's probably a complicated question and probably gets to a lot of the other transition portions of CEJA where we're trying to do, CEJA is the only bill that thinks about transition, that tries to set out a plan and provide funding for, well, just recognizing the basic fact that we're undergoing changes in our electric sector and in our transportation sector. So CEJA doesn't have a similar transition program. I mean, frankly, the EV fleet is just not large enough to put mechanics out of work. We're still we're still away from that, and that's probably something that a bill down the road will have to think about. So CEJA doesn't have transition language for specifically for mechanics or others whose profession is kind of tied to dealing with the internal combustion components of our existing fleet.
This is Pastor Vance. I think also, Matt, is that with the question earlier about the Biden movement, realizes that for years, the last 4 years, we didn't have a lot of room to do nothing. And now we've got room open, and CEJA was written under the auspices of the oppression we were kind of facing. Now we have the doors are open, and again, working with some of the initiatives from the national and the state level, there's wonderful opportunities. So I think the goal is to be creative and to push it. And we might as well push it as far as we can while we're in this new area.
Thanks. Yeah, hopefully a bunch of good things in the way in clean energy. Yeah, so then moving on to our next question, this one not about EVs. Jacqueline Casaza asks, how do these costs required to be paid for by ComEd, et cetera, compared to their costs today? I'm not sure which one that was in response to. I think that was in response to Andrew's presentation. Jacqueline, if you want to come off mute and give a little bit more context to your question, you are more than welcome to do that.
Yeah, thanks. It was in response to the Eevee presentation, just talking about how it was going to be paid for, especially with the heavier transit, I think, the buses and trucks and stuff.
Oh boy. So yeah, to accommodate widespread electric vehicle charging, it will require changes to upgrade. Well, let's call them upgrades. It'll require our grid to get better and change. Really, it's going to be more dynamic, and we're going to have to do a better job predicting behavior and where people are charging and when people are charging and spreading out kind of our electricity use a bit more. I mean, a good example is a lot of municipalities are converting their street lights to from either fluorescent or halogen lighting to LED lighting, and that leaves a ton of capacity on every single light pole because the LEDs take so much less energy to use than those others. That's just kind of extra electric capacity that some places are piloting to see if they can use that extra capacity on all of these streetlights for EVs. So it's just going to take a new level of flexibility. As far as the direct costs go, we're always paying to upgrade our grid and make improvements and stuff. And I think we'll use a different model and or use a similar model to pay for these upgrades. That's kind of a generic answer, but I'm not sure how to go into more detail there.
Awesome, thanks, Matt. With our last minute, I have two pretty similar questions from Bill Rehn and Barbara Scott on reliability. Bill Rehn asks, does CEJA address energy storage for nighttime non-solar conditions on a large scale?
So I was not the individual or the group that did the modeling, but what I'll say is in the short term, we have the nuclear fleet will still be around. And so the base load we have a lot of nuclear energy in Illinois. In the long term, as we get closer to 2050, we anticipate transmission and battery storage to be able to make up the difference here and make sure that we can meet energy needs 24/7.
Awesome. I think we actually do have time for one more then. So let me just, I pulled away from where I was. So I'm just gonna pull a random question. Stephen Sondheim asks, is there a plan for nuclear retirement?
So the CEJA doesn't, like, we're decarbonizing the electric sector. We're closing the fossil fuel plants. That's sort of a regulatory process. We also set the renewable portfolio standard to be 100% renewable by 2050. And so by 2050, yes, and that's after all of the dates, the planned closure dates of nuclear plants in Illinois. But that's how we get there, is by saying Illinois' energy needs to be 100% by 2050.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone who took the time to join this presentation. I will be sending out the recording as well as a bunch of links that we have in the chat and some good info for folks. And I'll also be sending out the contact information for our presenters as well. So if your question if we didn't have time for it, you can still ask that. But yeah, if folks want to join us for our next teach-in, it will be on lead service line replacement, and it will be next Tuesday, the 13th at noon. I'm putting the link to that one as well in the chat. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to see you all at our virtual lobby day on April 26th. Bye.